Over the weekend of April 5th, 2025, significant protests occurred both in the United States and internationally, reflecting widespread public dissent on various issues. In the United States, the Hands Off movement organized over 1,200 demonstrations across all 50 states, marking one of the single largest day protests since President Donald Trump returned to office. Millions participated, voicing opposition to several administration policies. Of these policies mentioned were government spending cuts, opposing significant reductions in federal programs, including cuts exceeding $12 billion in health funding and job reductions at the Department of Education. Elon Musk's role in the federal government. Demonstrators criticized Musk's leadership of the Department of Government Efficiency, expressing concerns over perceived authoritarian overreach and his centralization of power. And of course, the new tariffs that were announced this week. The administration's recent tariff implementations, which have impacted global markets and led to economic concerns, were also the focal point of protest. Major cities like Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago saw substantial turnouts. In Chicago, thousands gathered at Daley Plaza, marking the city's largest protest since Trump's return to office. Internationally, protests mirrored U.S. sentiments and addressed additional geopolitical issues. In Europe, hundreds gathered in cities such as Frankfurt, Berlin, Paris, and London to protest against Trump and Musk. Demonstrators expressed concerns over U.S. policies, including recent tariff announcements and perceived threats to democracy. In Morocco, tens of thousands protested Israel's offensive in Gaza, Israel's genocide in Gaza, criticizing U.S. policies, particularly those proposed by Donald Trump. The demonstration highlighted growing public outrage over the violence in Gaza and U.S. involvement in the region. These protests underscore a global wave of activism addressing domestic policies and international relations, reflecting widespread public concern over governmental actions and proposals. I've talked before about my participation in protest and my support for peaceful protests and demonstrations as a way to show unity and support policies and changes that we'd like to see happen. In this video, I'm going to be very critical of the protests that happened this weekend and of other recent protests that have been occurring. But I want to make it clear that I'm being critical because I want to see change that is actually substantial and reasonable and can happen. That being said, let's talk about protest and why they aren't effective. Taking this most recent example of the weekend. When did people protest? Saturday and Sunday. The weekends when most people, most Americans, are not at work. When most life is not being disrupted. What did they want? They were just saying that the things that the Trump administration is doing, the tariffs, Elon Musk's role in the current government, and the spending cuts are all things they want to see stop happening. These are good goals to put forth and have, but there's no real reason to give them to these people if, after Saturday and Sunday, these people are going to go home and return to their jobs. The rich and corporate elite in the structure of capitalism has done a great job of making it impossible for substantial protests and demonstrations to happen in the United States because of everyone's reliance and fear that without their jobs, they'll not be able to support themselves, their family, their health care, or be able to eat. By only protesting on Saturdays and Sundays, you're not actually committed to anything. You're saying this is something I'm going to do on my day off. That during my actual weekdays, when I should be at work, when I should be being productive, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be committed to this society, and I'm not going to actually fight for any real change because there is no way for me to actually break off these commitments to the society that is doing these things that I would like to see change. While I absolutely admire and respect people going out of their way, traveling, spending large amounts of money, using their time and effort that they could be doing relaxation or vacationing efforts and decompressing from the week to go out and to do these things on a Saturday. Overall, they're useless because as soon as Saturday's over, as soon as the day is done, the signs go down, the people get into their cars, and they go home. Let's talk about protests that were effective and how we know that they are effective. In April 2024, Columbia University students established the Gaza Solidarity Encampment on the East Butler Lawn. This peaceful occupation aimed to pressure the university into divesting from corporations profiting from what protesters described as Israeli apartheid, genocide, and occupation in Palestine. Organized by groups including the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Coalition, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Jewish Voice for Peace, the encampment drew inspiration from Columbia's history of student activism, such as protests against the Vietnam War in 1968 and the university's divestment from apartheid in South Africa in 1985. These encampments also happened across campuses in the entire United States. They were peaceful, despite what you hear on the news, and they were vilified and attacked by right-wing and left-wing media here in the United States. This is how we know that they were successful and actually worth doing. The encampments were broken up. Students who have taken part in these protests were expelled. If they had already graduated at the time of the rulings coming down, they had their graduations revoked. And with what we are seeing with Mahmoud Khalil, he is being, and other students as well with him, are currently facing deportation and criminalization simply because they took part in organizing these protests. During the massive Black Lives Matter protests, the majority of which were entirely peaceful, and when they did break down into riots, it was due to outside agitators and were immediately condemned by the organizers who made these movements happen. We saw similar reactions to those. We can also go back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, in which both sides of the media vilified and created rumors about these people and said that they are gross, disgusting hippies and used all of their might to disrupt them, destabilize them, and break them up. This has happened throughout all of history, and it was seen recently with these pro-Palestine protests, and we're still seeing the backlash from that now. This is how you know that these protests were effective and dangerous. When you see these reactions to them from the status quo, you can go back to the civil rights movement, to the peace movements, the anti-Vietnam movements, to other movements in which you see the governmental and corporate reactions to these protests and how you know they're actually have a chance of getting something done. What's going to happen from these protests over the weekend? They're going to get news coverage. There's going to be people talking about what the protesters want, and then that's going to be it. That's going to be the full stop point. On April 2nd, 2025, a group of Jewish students at Columbia University changed themselves to the gates of St. Paul's Chapel in protest of the arrest and detention of Mahmoud Khalil, a former Columbia student and pro-Palestinian activist. Khalil was detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, agents on March 8th under allegations of leading activities aligned with Hamas, despite not being charged with the crime. The protesting students demanded transparency from the university regarding his involvement in his detention, specifically seeking the disclosure of any trustees who may have provided information on federal authorities. They expressed concerns over the university's compliance with federal demands and the broader implications for student activism on campus. Once again, immediately these were vilified, immediately they were shut down, immediately the police showed up, cut the chains of these students, and arrested them. These are actual activist actions that can foresee change. Norman Finkelstein and other scholars have called for massive encampments to return across universities on all the campuses, which is hard to do because there's actual risk involved, risk that the students knew. There's no risk for people over the weekend outside of maybe getting sick or maybe having a loss of income because of going, which I shouldn't downplay. But for these students, they're facing expulsion. They have been expelled. They're facing deportation. They have been deported. They're facing worse. There's no risk to showing up on a Saturday and holding a sign, chanting at the top of your lungs, even if you're in Washington, D.C., outside the White House. If you're just going to go home tomorrow, there's no risk for that. You may be told to disperse. You may be told to leave after a certain point, but that's it. These people who have been actively participating in realistic and effective protest face real-life consequences. So how do we create effective change through peaceful demonstrations in the United States? Well, the first one is for activities like the encampments. Support those encampments. Hopefully they'll come back as the students have returned to college courses, and hopefully we will see more activism on campuses, despite freedom of speech being denounced and destroyed on campuses throughout the entire United States. The other way to effectively get change in the United States is to disrupt the civil process and disrupt capital. Supporting massive labor movements, a massive labor strike at Amazon and Walmart, for starters, would create real change, not only for the workers, but for taking back democracy for the actual American people. And then supporting global worker strikes, not only here in the United States, but throughout the entire world, to support things that work for all of the people and not just for the corporate elite and the employer class who are currently making all of the decisions. This is how you get change in Gaza. This is how you get change in the current administration. This is how you create change. By making actual realistic goals with actual realistic risk and saying, this is how long we're going to be here until this change happens. The encampments were going to be indefinite until they were broken up, until we saw these unfortunate consequences that should not happen because they were only exercising their freedom of speech and were entirely peaceful outside of a few sporadic incidents in which the majority of the time they were attacked by pro-Israeli and pro-genocide actors. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that this falls on some ears who can learn something, and I hope that we see some real change coming soon. But real change is not going to happen through one-day actions. If you'd like to support Palestine and Palestinian rights and hopefully end the genocide in Gaza, the first link in the description of this video will be for the United States Campaign of Palestinian Rights. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later this week.